is everyone ready? Alright, so quickly off time, I'd like to thank everyone in attendance for making this debate possible. To give a brief about, first going to the resolutions, a framework, then going to the case. So, start my time. The resolution today is, in the United States, the government is justified in limiting freedom of speech in order to prevent violent backlash against the speaker. Now, this is a background. The weighing mechanism will be constitutionality, and so basically I'll define the government is justified in limiting of freedom of speech in order to prevent violent backlash against the speaker, and that in the case where a person's speech, according to a reasonable person, would cause an imminent threat to their life and possibly cause their death, then the United States federal government, which is defined as all three branches as would normally be so, is justified in limiting their freedom of speech. Now the reason why I choose this definition is because the Supreme Court usually uses this mechanism of like what would, according to a reasonable person, would this be an imminent threat in order to decide these such cases such as hate speech. And basically how we see this in the real world was basically similar to laws against hate speech. If your speech, hate speech laws say if your speech causes an imminent harm to another person, then the government is justified in eliminating it. Well, we're saying if your speech also causes harm to yourself, the government is justified in eliminating it. Now, why we need to really look at constitutionality in this round is because the Constitution is the basis for rule of law in our country. It's the fundamental basis that says like what the government is supposed to act on. It's basically the basis of our government, and it's the basis of the social contract that we have in our government and the fundamental source of legitimacy for our country. So it's obviously what the government needs to be acting on. So our first contention today is that of scrutiny, and basically, so scrutiny is how the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution. So it's basically an extension of constitutionality, and there are 3 degrees of scrutiny that are looked at when you look at rights, and when you look at like what needs to be in place in order to limit a right. And these have to do with like, is it constitutional to limit a right, which goes into our case. First is reasonability, second is moderate, and third is strict. Now all of these have 3 prongs. The first is that there needs to be a compelling government interest in order to limit the right. The second is that it needs to be narrowly tailored so it only limits the right, doesn't limit a bunch of other things too. And third is that it needs to be the least restrictive means, so that it's the least restrictive means possible of limiting this right. Now we like to point out that similarly to hate speech, limiting a person's freedom of speech in the context that would cause an imminent threat to their life as a reasonable person would judge, fulfills all these 3 prongs even under strict scrutiny, therefore is strictly constitutional. Yes, I'll take it.
Can you give an example of when speech has caused an imminent threat to someone?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so for instance, one example that's commonly used in the Supreme Court in oral argument, etc., is like yelling that you have a bomb when you're on a plane. That will cause a panic, cause imminent threat to everyone on the plane, including yourself. And the Supreme Court said, in that instance, national security of you, the people on the plane, overrides it, and you can't just yell that you have a bomb when you're on the plane. And so that goes into my 3 sub-contentions, basically how, I'll get to in a minute, basically how limiting the speech that had an imminent threat to you would fulfill these 3 prongs. First off, compelling government interest. This is really important. So basically, the government has a compelling interest to protect citizens' lives. If something is going to cause an imminent death of someone, then in order to uphold the social contract upon which the nation is based, where we give up some of our freedoms to the government, and in turn, they protect us and protect our welfare. So this is helping the government protect our lives and also protect our further rights by keeping order in society. So basically, we see that the government has a very legitimate interest looking after the lives of citizens. Also, it is very narrowly tailored. It's not restricting anything else. It just says, you probably shouldn't say things that are causing imminent harm to your imminent death. Also, least restrictive means, once again, this is only in the case where it would cause imminent death, and it's not limiting like free speech that might harm you in general, so it's the least restrictive means possible. So basically, the summation of this contention is that under strict scrutiny, the strictest way to interpret it, say, is it constitutional to limit this right? This is clearly constitutional. Okay, yeah.
Has yelling a bomb on a plane ever got someone killed?
Because as I don't know of any actual instance where anyone would do that, because of the fact that it would probably get you killed if you do that, or it could cause chaos, or it could cause all sorts of disruption. It'd be an extremely unsafe thing to do. And I'll be going into precedent to my next contention, so thank you for leading there. And basically say like when is the Supreme Court rule that it's constitutionally okay to limit free speech, and why this is the same. So first I'd like to talk about campaign financing. So in Citizens United, the Supreme Court judged that basically giving money is the same by corporations, the same thing as symbolic free speech. And basically in Buckley v. Vallejo, the Supreme Court said that once again giving money is symbolic free speech. However, the Supreme Court also said that it's okay to have individual limits on how much money you contribute to an individual candidate, because the government has a legitimate interest in doing so. And this was actually ruled under strict scrutiny. So this is an example of when the government has a legitimate interest. The Supreme Court has ruled that you can limit their free speech. Second is that of basically the welfare of citizens, which includes national security, overrides like free speech in small instances. This is sort of has to go into like the Patriot Act and like limiting in free speech that basically like citizens' rights and citizens' well-being has been valued by the Supreme Court over citizens' rights. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld this with the Patriot Act, like the citizens' well-being that has to do with national security. The Supreme Court values over like citizens' right to free speech, against detainment, etc. So we can further see how this is constitutional. Yes?
Does political funding in the past, has it ever caused a death to someone and therefore it should be limited?
It could cause death by impact, because for instance, you know, if you politically fund someone, you could that person in office could be like defunding some program that pays for healthcare or something, and then someone could die as a result of that program. So basically, the point is that we're doing this by the least restrictive means possible. And I can think of an example such as for instance, like burning a Quran in the middle of like a highly fundamental like Islamic area could cause an imminent threat to someone's life, and the government has a compelling interest in order to prevent that. Okay, so another contention is that of hate speech, which I like to point out, this is basically the same thing as hate speech. In hate speech, it says you can't say something that causes an imminent threat to someone else's life. Well, you can't say something that causes an imminent threat to your life either, because the government has an interest in protecting you too. You're an American citizen, and the government has a social contract with you, should be protecting you too. Now, the way that hate speech, for instance, can lead you to an imminent threat to someone's life is you see, like, for instance, hate speech can cause such thing as suicide, can cause such thing as like targeted riots, targeted crimes, and it's the same sort of thing. You can say something that will cause other people to target you for crimes. You can say and that obviously causes an imminent threat to your life. Now, we can see that this resolution is pretty targeted, and it's targeted to a very specific instance, and we say imminent threat because it fulfills all the prongs of strict scrutiny. So you can see that these cases that would probably cause like some criminal organization or some criminal activity towards you would really fulfill these cases. So for all these reasons, because it falls clearly under strict scrutiny, which is the strictest way to say that a right may be limited, and because there's clear precedent for this when the government has a compelling interest and is least restrictive and narrowly tailored, this clearly upholds constitutionality, and the government, which operates upon constitutionality, is very justified in doing so. So for all these reasons, there's a strong vote in favor of the government team. Thank you.
Is this, how long is the speech? 8 minutes? 8 minutes. Right. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So to begin, first I would like to thank everyone, of course, for being here and making this debate possible. But the first thing I would like to talk about in terms of this debate is the weighing mechanism or framework for this round, which has been defined as constitutionality by the affirmation. Now, if we want to look at the actual resolution and the wording of the resolution itself, which says that the government is justified in limiting freedom of speech in order to prevent violent backlash against the speaker, it doesn't say the government is constitutional in limiting freedom of speech in order to prevent violent backlash against the speaker. And while they look to constitutionality as like the empirics of American law and law creation, while that is true, that the Constitution is not a definition of what is justified. And so because of that, we can see that we should not be looking at the Constitution as the weighing mechanism for this round, but really justification as a whole, and not justification in terms of its parallelism with constitutionality. So with that in mind, you should reject this idea of constitutionality as a weighing mechanism, but hold justification, not constitutionality, as the framework. So with that in mind, I'm just going to be going into their 3 points and then also go on to my own refutations. Before I get to that, I'll take your point of order.
Okay, well, it's a point of information, but so I was wondering, like, so we define justification as constitutionality and the fundamental basis of our government. How do you define justified?
Justified is more of like a moral and social responsibility rather than just constitutional responsibility. So it entails, of course, the things that have been seen in the United States history and law, which is really what the Constitution is the basis for their Constitution argument, but also it invokes a moral and social responsibility more going further than that. So going on to look at their first point, which looks at critical scrutiny, we can see that first they talk about the idea of a bomb on a plane, that it leads to a compelling government interest Precedent specifically, their first argument is that if there's compelling argument or government interest in like creating some sort of law against this, then the government should do it. However, we can see that there is not a compelling argument or compelling government interest. Now, as my partner came up and said in his own POI, has there been ever evidence of somebody who's yelled bomb on a plane, and because of that, that person died, and that is the definition that they give of violent backlash, that the person is either must like be in threat of death, like in a life-threatening situation, they only could say probably, and because of that, we can see that there's actually no empirical evidence that they can point to that would give a reason as to why there is a compelling government interest into this. There's no compelling government interest to limit free speech if there is no actual imminent threat onto either the person or others who are in that situation. So because of that, you're seeing there's no actual empirical evidence or solid foundation for that claim. Also, they look to the precedence of imminent death in this scenario. And once again, we have to look at the fact that they could never prove to us in any of the POIs that they were asked as to why it is that this would lead to imminent death. We look at first, of course, the fact of Citizens United. They never prove why this will lead to imminent death. We look at the Patriot Act and how they brought it up. It never led to imminent death. And we also look at, once again, the bomb on a plane issue, and they never said that this would lead to an imminent death. And so because of that, we can see that there is no empirical example of this. I'm sorry, I don't really have a lot of time to get through all this stuff. So second, of course, is that of empirics. Now, first off, they talk about the Citizens United case and how this was limited free speech by saying that the free speech of giving money to a campaign, like a presidential campaign, should be limited, and in this way. But once again, we can see that it is not for a personal well-being. The Citizens United case is once again looking at campaign donations. It's not at all about really the personal well-being of one person who is giving away this money. It's looking at the Citizens United case is looking at a corporation, which is a body of a lot of different people. And so because of that, you're not looking at the justification to prevent violent backlash against one speaker. You're looking at what is happening in terms of a corporation. And once again, they cannot prove that this even led to imminent death. Second is the Patriot Act, which is not as much about free speech, but about the sort of limits and that the government has in terms of investigating and watching its own citizenry. And once again, it's not as much about free speech, and thus doesn't even really link into the debate today of what we're actually arguing. With that in mind, I'll take your point of information.
So are you aware we're not saying that these three examples are reasons why we should limit free speech in order to prevent violent backlash against the speaker? These are just alternative examples of when the Supreme Court has ruled that the First Amendment can be limited in an example. These are not like specific examples of when the person is in danger. It's examples when the First Amendment has been able to be changed.
Well, even if that's the case and they're not examples of when a person has been in imminent danger, that only proves to you why it is that these examples have no weight at all in this round. Because what we should be looking at is things that are involved with the imminent threat and imminent death or violent backlash against a person, not other cases where free speech has been stopped due to constitutionality, as they like to point out to, but really what we should be looking to is the justification of whether or not we should be weighing this free speech over the imminent threat of a person's life. And because of that, these three examples that they give to us today have no weight in this round. Now, so their third point, of course, is they talk about hate speech. Now, I would like to point out to you, the judges, and of course to everyone in this round, that the reason the United States federal government stops hate speech is because one person who says something, or as the affirmation team also points out, is because it leads to violence against another person. Whereas what the resolution itself talks about is violence against the speaker themselves. And while the speaker themselves has sovereignty over their own life, they don't have sovereignty over the life of someone else, which is why they cannot advocate hate speech, which leads to the violence against someone else. And the reason that this is not justified and not socially justified is because the person who is speaking has sovereignty over their own life. They have the freedom of choice to say what they want. And that sort of stuff does not apply to hate speech. And with that in mind, I'm actually going to direct your attention to the 5 major points that we as the negation will give to you. I'm sorry, I don't really have a lot of time. So first, of course, is the fact that there is no line of distinction. They, as the affirmation, could not even prove to you one empiric as to why, when somebody says X in specific, like one person says, I have a bomb on a plane, this has always led to imminent violence against them, or it has always led to the death of the speaker. They can never prove to you any line of distinction as to why it is that this, or one specific statement should be stopped from, or should not be said because it could lead to violence against the speaker. They can't make a blanket statement about a variety of political ideas without having to have without having any empirical basis against it. Second, of course, the fact that diversity of opinions is good. Decreasing the diversity of opinions is a harm to social development, and was actually discussed in the well-known essay by Barbara Bilderbeck of Real Patriots Speak Their Minds, which talks about the fact that people who create social development, especially in America, if we want to look to American history, it was because they advocated ideas that weren't very popular, but they had some social truths to them at their basis. And because that they spoke their mind despite the fact that there may have been some sort of violent backlash against them, but because of the fact that they were creating a larger social change that goes beyond the life of one person. Third, of course, the fact that the violence is not an imminent issue. If we look to their examples, we can see there is no imminent threat. If we want to look to other examples of perhaps the Westboro Baptist Church, which has often been an advocate of hate speech, or anti-war demonstration, which has been a very contentious issue in the United States for a long time, we can see that there has been no imminent violent threat against these people, and because of that this violence is a non-issue. Fourth, of course, is the freedom of choice. As I said before, this is a self-regulatory issue. As the person has sovereignty over their own life, they should have the ability to say what they want because they have the sovereignty over their own life, and not the government should be controlling what they have to say. And this is once again a self-regulatory issue, not a government regulatory issue. Fifth, and most important, is the fact that more violence is created. If we look at France, which actually stops people from wearing religious symbols in public, ostensible religious symbols in public, which stops people from wearing hijabs, from wearing yarmulkes, from wearing crosses in public, we can see that this actually led to more violent backlash, especially amongst the Muslim community, and created even more institutional violence against these, and created more xenophobia against the Muslim community, because these people, they view them as different, and because that it's created more social violence. So with that in mind, you're once again voting in favor of the negation. Thank you.
What's the title of your fourth contention? I just didn't hear it.
Freedom of choice.
Social contract interest criticisms. We do. Who's after?
Alright, so in this round, first I'm going to make kind of an observation, then I'll go into kind of the framework issues, and then our contentions, and then theirs. Is that okay? Alright, so starting my time first, I would just like to thank everyone in attendance, judge, partner, and my opponents for making this round possible. So first, just to give to go into the framework. So we define justified as kind of justified in terms of constitutionality, in terms of the federal government. My opponents responded with several things. First of all, they said that the resolution does not say constitutionality. However, as the affirmation, we have the burden of defining the terms. Now, the only time in parliamentary debate when the negation can redefine the terms is when there is a conflict of, when our definition takes away ground from my opponent's A, or B is not topical. Now, my opponents never specified if they were running topicality or not, but they also never provided any sort of ground that we're taking away from them. They never provided any reasons why we're taking away clash in this round. They never had any educational benefits that we're taking away from this round, any sort of fairness, anything. They have no voters, no standards if they are running topicality, and if they're not, there's absolutely no reasons why they said they should prefer this mystical definition that they never really provided over our alternative. They never really provided a strong alternative. Furthermore, going into our contentions. Now, our first contention is that of scrutiny. Now, there's three different kinds of scrutiny that the Supreme Court uses. The first is reasonability. Now, reasonability means that at least one of the three different prongs needs to be upheld. Moderate scrutiny means that at least two, and strict scrutiny means that at least three. All of these different ways have been used in the past in different cases, so we're going to consider all three. So now the first one is compelling government interest. So essentially what this says is that this means there needs to be an imminent threat of death. Now that's exactly what the resolution says. The compelling government interest is that there is an imminent threat of death. Now the job of the government, in terms of their job as a whole, in terms of the social contract, in terms of all of these things, is to save the lives of the people, is to uphold their lives, their quality of life, all of these things. That is the literal job of the government. Now, if there's an imminent threat of death, and there is a threat of violent backlash against the speaker, it is the government's job to protect its citizen, to essentially save their life. That is the job of the government, so therefore there is a compelling government interest. Now, my opponents responded by saying we have no empirical evidence. Now, my opponents have said this time after time after time. Now, this is completely false. We talked about how yelling bomb on an airplane. Now, they said that there's absolutely no proof that says that this will cause death. Okay, yeah, we obviously can't read the future and not going to know that every single time this is going to happen, but if you look to 9/11, in one of the airplanes, the one that crashed in the field, the terrorists actually told the people, we are hijacking this airplane, we are going to crash it, and the people took over the airplane and crashed it into the ground, killing literally everyone on board. So when the terrorist said, I am going to do this, regardless of if he was going to actually or not, the people crashed the airplane, killing everyone on board. So that's an example of when someone said something that caused imminent threat of death to them, as well as other people. That's an example. We also provided alternative examples. For example, in terms of gangs, we also provided the example of burning a Quran in a very Muslim area, burning a Bible in a very Catholic area, these kinds of things. My opponents failed to respond to this. Maybe they misheard us. I'm not sure, but that's their only response, so it shouldn't be considered. Now our second subpoint under scrutiny is that are narrowly tailored. We talk about how there's no alternative. This is the only, it's only if there's an imminent threat of death, and it doesn't really, kind of contradict any other right. My opponents fail to respond to this, so essentially what that means is that this is upheld in in the world of the affirmation. So since this one is upheld in the world of the affirmation, we already uphold reasonability in that type of scrutiny. So it's already one type of scrutiny that we uphold. Furthermore, I'll get to you later if I have time. Now the third subpoint under this was least restrictive means. We talk about how there's only this, we're only talking about the threat of imminent death, and it only affects this specific right. Again, my opponents did not respond to this. That is two prongs of scrutiny that we uphold. Therefore, we uphold not only reasonability in terms of scrutiny, but also moderate scrutiny. Now the only other one left is strict scrutiny, and my opponent's only response was something that they misheard. That we said their only response was we had no evidence. We clearly did have evidence, they just misheard it. So essentially you can see we uphold all three types of strict scrutiny, and even if you don't believe, or if you still believe their response to it about the examples, we still uphold the other two, upholding reasonability scrutiny and moderate scrutiny. Furthermore, our second contention, I told you I'd get to you later 5 times. Our second contention was that of precedent. We talk about, we have several examples. First is campaign finances. Campaign finances, we talk about Citizens United, Buckley versus Vallejo. This was ruled on strict scrutiny. So you can see that is precedent that will show that this will be ruled on scrutiny again. It ruled first that donating money to a campaign is a form of expression, is a form of free speech, but it was okay to limit it in certain circumstances. That was an example when they've been able to limit free speech. Second example is national security. We talk about the Patriot Act. We talk about no yelling bomb on an airplane, that it can override free speech in small instances. And then our third example is hate speech. Now what I'd like to point out is hate speech was actually ruled based on reasonability. What that means is only one prong of scrutiny needs to be upheld out of compelling government interest, narrowly tailored, and least restrictive. And since my opponents dropped 2 of them, that means they agree. Therefore, at least 2 of them are already upheld, meaning that in the case of hate speech, and in that example, we are already passing this, and this will already be upheld in terms of constitutionality. Now, my opponents responded by saying, how is there an imminent threat of death? We have no examples. We're not saying that these 3 examples are imminent threat of death. My opponents failed to understand what we were talking about whatsoever. We're talking about why it is sometimes okay to limit the First Amendment in certain circumstances. These are 3 examples of certain circumstances when it has been okay. We're providing another alternative. My opponents failed to understand what we're talking about. Furthermore, they talk about how hate speech is different because it's violence against others, not against yourself. However, do they think that murder is more important than suicide, that killing yourself is not important in terms of suicide? Obviously not. Both are incredibly important. Both should not happen. Similarly, hate speech and speech that hurts yourself should not happen, just as murder and suicide should not happen. Now moving on to my opponent's contentions. Okay, now I'd like to get into my observation. My observation is that we're not taking away all free speech. We're not saying if you say something that might upset someone, then you can't do it. That's literally not what we're saying at all, and my opponent's entire case rests on that. What we are saying is that if someone is going to say something that will cause an imminent threat of death, for example, yelling bomb on an airplane, causing the rest of the people to crash the airplane into a field, killing everyone, including the speaker, that is something that shouldn't happen because it will literally kill the speaker and potentially everyone else. So now moving on to their first contention, they talk about there's no line of distinction. They say we have no evidence once again. We've provided several examples. My opponents clearly were not listening. They did not hear our examples. We have had the example of bombs on an airplane, talking about gangs, burning a Quran in a Muslim area, burning a Bible in a Catholic area, burning a Torah in a Jewish area. All of these examples are times when there's imminent threat of death to the speaker. Obviously, we can't see the future. Obviously, we can't say every single time one of these things happens, someone is going to die. But if there is the potential that it will happen, we believe, just similarly to hate speech, that the government should protect the people, protect the lives of its citizens. Now, going on to the second contention. They talk about diversity of opinions are good. Yeah, we agree, diversity of opinions are good. That's not what we're saying. We're saying if someone is saying something that will cause imminent threat of death to that person, that should not be said. Going back to the airplane example, yelling bomb on an airplane, causing the people to either kill you or crash the plane and kill everyone is obviously not good. We're not saying that diversity of opinions is bad. My opponents are trying to twist our words and trying to make us advocate for something that we don't need to advocate. The resolution simply says violent backlash towards the speaker. We're not arguing against diversity of opinions. Third contention was violence is not imminent. Like I already said, obviously we cannot see the future. We cannot say that every single time someone's going to die, but similar to hate speech, we can do our best to predict when there is an imminent threat to the speaker, to the person, and that is the government's job to protect them. That is their job as the government. Their fourth contention, they talk about how people should have the right of choice, all these kinds of things. This is kind of the same thing as their second one. We're not taking away the right of choice. We're simply saying that the people should not have a right to danger themselves or other people, similar to hate speech. And then lastly, they talk about violence, more violence was created. They're about how France banned religious symbols. This is an extreme example. That's not what we're doing whatsoever. My opponents are again trying to make us advocate for something that we don't need to advocate for in the resolution. We're simply saying that people should not be able to advocate for something that causes an imminent threat of death to themselves. That is not what France did, therefore it should not be considered in this round. So for all these reasons that my opponents are kind of trying to make us advocate for something that we're not, and they're failing to kind of adequately talk about the resolution, I urge a strong vote in favor of the affirmation. Thank you.
So are the judges ready? Okay. Opponents?
Yeah.
Okay. So first off, I'll just be clarifying the framework. Really, the framework in this debate was constitutionality or strict justification. We simply see that in the negation world, that constitutionality is a way to view justification, but we have to understand that we cannot limit the debate to simply constitutionality, because as they state within their own example, the Constitution has changed time and time again, and therefore cannot be used as a simple example to simply weigh this debate. We have to be looking at justifications. Is the United States actually justified in being able to change the Constitution in this sort of way to justify this means? Therefore, we're looking at strict justification, so we hope that you evaluate this debate in that way. Now go on to their first contention, where they bring up the idea of scrutiny, and how they bring up three prongs of compelling, narrowly tailored, and basically least restrictive. First off, look at the example that in response, basically when they bring up the idea of compelling and the prong of compelling, they said that the threat of death is there, and that because the threat of death is there, there has to be a reason for the United States federal government to essentially limit free speech. When we ask for an example, they simply give the bomb example, and a very extreme example of 9/11, where the terrorists yelled that they had a bomb, and therefore everybody on the plane was killed. But what they really don't solve for is they don't show how, if limiting free speech was in place, would the bomb threat have actually been deterred? Would the plane not have gone down? Really, they don't show that limiting free speech actually has an impact on causing death to decrease, or actually making death not possible for these people who speak out. They don't show how limiting free speech would actually be able to avoid this impact and avoid death. So because of this, you see that limiting free speech actually is not compelling, and it therefore cannot be weighed in a constitutional way, not this time. Therefore, going on to their point of narrowly tailored, they say that it's not restricting, but then we have to understand that it is not narrowly tailored to the circumstances. As they state themselves, they cannot look toward the future, and they're trying to make a blanket statement, trying to cover for basically all free speech, and they don't even have a definition of what type of free speech would be the ones that would actually compel, that actually would restrict a violent response. They don't show what kind of speech actually does. They don't show a diversification of what speech classifies as this kind of hate speech that actually causes harm towards the person. Because they can't give any definition as to what this type of speech is, it's a very blanket definition, and therefore is not narrowly tailored toward the point that we're making. Also, basically understand that they don't show any evidence from the past of when people have put themselves in harm's way by simply speaking out or advocating for free speech. Because this has not happened in the past, and they don't provide any example, we can't be looking towards this in this debate today, because they don't show how it is exactly either compelling or narrowly tailored or even the least restrictive. It is actually one of the most restrictive means, because they don't have any way of regulating it. They don't show what type of free speech would be limited and what type wouldn't. They simply say as long as it causes harm. But what type of speech causes harm? They don't really define this. They give you the one bomb example, but really this doesn't actually encompass anything in this debate today. Yes?
Okay, so are you aware that we said in a situation that when a reasonable person would clearly agree that this would cause imminent harm, this is what the Supreme Court usually uses.
But how does the Supreme Court really justify this? You don't really give any reasoning as to how exactly the Supreme Court can rule this kind of free speech is actually bad and this kind of free speech is actually good. Not this time. So now go on to the second point, where they bring up empirics and how they have different examples of how essentially the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of limiting free speech. But again, we have to understand that this is a completely different example. Looking towards the idea of the campaign financing, how campaign financing is able to be limited. We asked for the link of how limiting campaign financing actually could cause death, and therefore is relatable to this resolution today. They don't really show this link. They simply say that people would die because if a president were to be elected, they could disregard some services and therefore cause a death to people. But really, also look towards the fact that this isn't the speaker who's getting hurt. It's not the speaker who's getting killed. It's other factors, but it doesn't really make sense. The link that they provide you really isn't clear. So basically, they don't really have a link to scrutiny. Therefore, because they can't bring that scrutiny link, there actually is no death. Also towards the fact that there's different circumstances, and that basically these three examples that they give do not relate to the resolution today. And also that there's no imminent threat. They don't provide you any imminent threat that comes off of this free speech. They don't provide you any example to look towards. And not this time. Now go on, not this time. So go on to the third contention, where they bring up the idea of hate speech. And we try and counter that by simply saying that they have no example of a death to a speaker. They don't show you any clear example as where one person spoke out, and because they spoke out, they died. In no other circumstance and no other different way would they have been killed. But because they spoke out, they were killed. Because they don't provide this example, this really refutation that they give of preventing suicide and preventing death really doesn't hold because they can provide no example of how people have actually killed themselves by speaking out. They don't show how people have committed a suicide basically by speaking out against people. Sure, yeah.
Okay, so would you like agree that saying something exclamatory to a gang member would likely like probably provoke your death?
But you don't really show how the Supreme Court can actually limit that because you don't provide that limitation. How the Supreme Court or the USFG would be able to limit that, you can't avoid the death. You don't show how limiting it, you give a very broad definition of limiting free speech. You don't show how this limitation can actually avoid death. Just saying that doesn't really have an impact in this debate, not this time. So now go on to the negation case and the points that we bring you. First off, attack their observation that they say that the threat of death is imminent, but they cannot provide any example showing that death was imminent. The only example they can actually give is the example of the 9/11 bombings and the 9/11 terrorist attack. And we can actually see that this is turned because they don't show you how limiting free speech would have stopped this. How would it have stopped the terrorists from actually continuing through their plan or causing the people to fight back? This doesn't really have any impact, and because limiting free speech doesn't avoid death, you can actually weigh this in favor of the negation because it's a frivolous way for the United States federal government to try and limit free speech. Now go on to our first contention, where you state that there's no line of distinction. This is a clear point that we have to understand. They really give a blanket solution and state that there is a potential for people to die if they speak out for something. But really they don't show what this limit is. Where is this line? They simply say possible gang members or possible people in hijackings, but they don't really show where is this threat happening? How can the United States federal government actually make sure to regulate this kind of free speech? Because they can't regulate it, it's a very not clear line of distinction. They can't show what kind of speech would be regulated, what kind wouldn't. Because they don't show you this regulation, there's no clear line of distinction. Therefore, any things that they bring you from their side of this debate really don't have any impact because they're giving a blanket solution to a problem that doesn't deserve a blanket solution. Now go on to our second contention. We're bringing you the diversification of opinion. How in the past in the United States, having a diverse set of opinions has actually been beneficial towards the United States in actually seeking progress. But really in response to this, the negation teams, the affirmation team simply stated that they're not limiting speech and that they still encourage people to speak out. They encourage a diversification of opinions. They only say that if it causes death, therefore it should be limited. But just understand, they provide no examples. How has it actually caused death to a person? They haven't shown this. They give very little examples because they can't provide an example, therefore we can't be looking towards it in this debate today. Now, look at our third contention. When they ask for examples and they actually ignore our two examples of organizations that speak out and receive no violent impacts towards themselves, the Westboro Baptist Church, for example, and anti-war demonstrators. We see that these two organizations are able to speak their mind in a way that is probably very inflammatory, speaking anti-gay and anti-war, which really, because of this, they haven't received a violent negative backlash. Simply people coming out and supporting and going against them with their words, not using violence or a mode of violence, protected time. So not using violence as a method of not using violence to try and make their point. So because of this, we see that there is actually no harm because of this. With the Westboro Baptist Church, having free speech and having this doesn't actually create a violent harm. Now towards our fourth contention, where we say that the freedom of choice is very important, that people have sovereignty over what they can say. And because of this, the government really has no way to regulate this, especially when they state that they're trying to stop the fear of death for people. This really doesn't have any weight in this debate today. Again, look at the fact that they provide no examples. And then finally, on our fifth main contention, is that actually limiting free speech can cause more violence. In the issue of France, we see that the French government actually made it so that people were not allowed to voice their opinions or actually show who they were as being Muslim or Christian. Actually took this free speech away from them. And there has been negative backlashes, such as protests within the French government, as well as violent uprising because people want to speak their mind and because the government is trying to limit this. And because of this, we urge the strongest vote in the negation in this debate today. Thank you.
Everyone's ready? So as the last negative speaker with these 4 minutes, I'm just going to try and go over 5 main voter issues for you guys, or for you, the judges. And first, of course, the fact that is this narrowly tailored issue. Now, their first point of contention is the fact that this, their law that or the fact that this is justified in limiting freedom of speech is because it's narrowly tailored. But however, we can say that it's the complete opposite of what is true. Now, when we ask them several times to give us like a concrete definition of what's like one phrase, for example, that would lead to imminent violent backlash and imminent death of the speaker, they can't prove give to you any specific instance. They give to you the bomb threat and how this probably would have led to someone, or this probably was an example of how it led to someone's death. But then once again, we ask them like the specifics of how this occurred, and we can see that they don't actually see that limiting the free speech would have solved for that issue. Still, we can see that in that instance, the hijacking of the plane, the goal of the hijackers was to crash the plane. So even if they didn't say anything and the people didn't take over, they would have crashed the plane either way. So they don't solve for that issue. And because of that, you can see that overall, they're not getting a narrowly tailored benefit out of this. What they're doing is creating a blanket statement. And with that in mind, you can see that because there's no bright line, thus they are either limiting all things or they're limiting nothing. And if they're limiting all things, this is not narrowly tailored, because anyone could be offended and have a violent backlash against something that anyone says. Or if they're not limiting anything and what they advocate has no difference. So because of that, you can see that there's not a huge benefit coming out of this for the affirmation, but actually pointing out a huge detriment, a huge cost, which when linking back into the weighing mechanism of social and moral responsibility of this justification, you can see that you're taking away a lot of freedom of speech without getting an actual benefit out of it. Now, second, of course, is hate speech and freedom of choice. Now, they point to the fact that hate speech is often cited by the Constitution and by the Supreme Court as something that should not happen because it protects violence against somebody else who's being referred to in this speech. However, once again, we have to look at the fact of freedom of choice. If a person is speaking and they themselves are the one in imminent danger, then they have sovereignty over their own life. They don't have sovereignty over the life of someone else, and that's what makes hate speech so very different from what is being advocated by the affirmation. And third, of course, is the fact of this imminent threat. They can never prove to us one example of where there is an imminent threat based on one thing that is, when somebody says there is a bomb threat on a plane, they never prove to us why it is that this has always led to an imminent threat of violence and actually an imminent threat of death. This can never be proved to us in any of the speeches, and as much as they want to say that they give us a lot of evidence by pointing to this bomb threat argument, that's not the case. This is not evidence. This is a hypothetical argument. Whereas we actually give you evidence. We talk about the Westboro Baptist Church. We talked about the anti-war demonstrations that happen, and which are extremely inflammatory, yes, but they don't actually lead to violence against the speakers. They may lead to verbal violence that say that you're wrong and your opinion is wrong, but they don't actually lead to physical violence or the threat of death. But fourth, of course, is the fact that this leads to increased violence. If we look to the France example, which is actually concrete evidence as compared to their hypothetics, we can see that this led to institutional violence against a lot of Muslims. And the reason that this was stopped in the first place, the ostensible wearing of religious symbols was stopped in the first place, is because the government believed that a lot of the violence against the people who are Muslim, mostly of the Muslim community, was because they were wearing religious symbols that caused people to have a violent backlash against them. So it very much links into the the resolution today. But the fact of the matter is that when they stopped the wearing of religious symbols, this led to institutional backlash and an institutional oppression of their culture, which is in itself an institutional violence against these people, and a very xenophobic institutional violence against these people, and it led to backlash and rioting, especially among the Muslim community, especially among Muslim women who could not any longer wear their hijab in public. And fifth, of course, is the fact of diversity of opinions, which has never really been addressed by the affirmation team, is the fact that, as we pointed out in this in the popular essay by Barbara Bilderbeck, that real patriots speak their minds, what people say, even though it may be unpopular, often leads to social developments that go beyond the life of one person. And that's why you should be weighing the diversity of opinions over anything that the affirmation can say. Thank you.
And I have it on the other side too. Just so you know. Okay, so I'm gonna flip over when I get it.
Sorry. Sorry about that.
Alright. So, is everyone ready? Okay, so briefly, in this speech I'm going over the voter issues. First we're looking at framework, then we're looking at voter issues. Okay, so speaking of time, once again, I'd like to thank everyone for being here. Now, first off, I'd like to look at this framework issue, basically what should the weighing mechanism be. Now, like we said constitutionality because the United States government is, the rule of law is based on constitutionality. They exist because the Constitution is what they're meant to uphold. Now, the opposition team says we should look at social responsibility and some nebulous concept of justice, but they don't give any reason why we should do this, and we give a very strong reason why we should do this. See, the impact of disregarding the Constitution, having the government, which is meant to be based upon the Constitution, act upon something else, totally nullifies every right that we have as Americans that are upheld in the Constitution and the social contract inherent within it. That is the government's job to provide the welfare for their people, and the people give up some of their rights in order for the government to protect them, which is really inherent to this round today. So basically, the impacts of disregarding the Constitution totally undermine like every order in our society, every legitimacy that our government has, and the rule of law in our society. So these are just huge impacts, and we are upholding the Constitution, therefore it should be weighed upon this. Okay, so, and also I will point out, we went in under both definitions, but we'll go into that later. Now, first motivation in this debate is the fact that, that hate speech and the other examples that we put that are very similar to like this situation, in which it's basically like hate speech against yourself, were ruled under reasonability, which only required one prong of like the constitutional framework to do, and they dropped why this is narrowly tailored and why this is the least restrictive means. So therefore, since reasonability only requires one prong, they basically agree that it's constitutional. So under the definition of constitutionality, we win right there because they already have just given us two prongs straight through the flow. The only one they ever bothered to even argue against was compelling government interest, and they put themselves in a double bind this way, and I'll explain why. Okay, so basically, they say that these situations don't exist. The whole huge portion of their debate was like, there's no way anyone could ever say something that could endanger their life. Now, first off, this is inherently ridiculous. There are many things a person could say, such as that could incite gang violence, that could incite like violence from like a religious fundamentalism. You know, like the talk saying you're gonna have a bomb on the plane is a good example. There are many reasons why you do this, but also it's completely irrelevant whether or not the situation exists. That's not what we're arguing about. What we're arguing about is, in this situation, is the government justified? So judges just disregard all their arguments that these situations don't exist because they're completely irrelevant. It's not what we're arguing about. But also, they say that these situations don't even exist. They also say that limiting people's freedom of speech in these situations that a reasonable person would think would cause imminent harm would totally destroy people's right to free speech. It would be the same thing as in France, where there are people not allowed to display religious symbols. And basically, this is a double bind because they can't have it both ways. Like, either these situations exist, they're saying these situations don't exist, and they're saying they're hurt-free speech. So they kill all their hurt-free speech impacts through this double bind that they're in. But also, I'd like to point out that we're looking on specifically at strict scrutiny, and basically, does the government have a compelling interest to do this? And there's two things you have to weigh in this. So first off, their citizens' lives. Like, this has an imminent threat to your life. And then they have this like right basically to suicide, like right to people control whether or not they're living. And I like to point out that there is inherent in the Constitution a social contract which involves caring for citizens' welfare, and citizens' welfare obviously includes your life. Your life is obviously like inherent to your welfare, whereas suicide is detrimental to their welfare, and there's no constitutional guarantee to suicide. So basically, you see that what we're advocating here, just protecting citizens' welfare against imminent harm, which would be death, clearly outweighs what they're advocating, which is like your right to suicide, basically, which doesn't exist. So you can clearly see that under this framework, we win. But also under their nebulous framework, that doesn't make sense for a government, which has to act on the Constitution, like social responsibility. Clearly, it's more important to prevent people from dying, to save their lives, than just preserve their like so-called right to suicide. People don't have a right to suicide, and we need to like saving their lives is obviously inherent to their well-being. So we see we win under social responsibility as well. So we clearly see that in these situations, first off, what we're debating isn't whether these situations exist. All those arguments are completely irrelevant. Second off, in these situations, we have clearly chosen this is very narrowly tailored. This is not like France. That law is not narrowly tailored, therefore is not applicable. It applies to all religious symbols, not just if they threaten someone's life. If they threaten someone's life is very narrowly tailored. It's clearly the least restrictive means possible to uphold protecting the value of life, which is necessary for this social contract, while not infringing on people's rights. Now, in France, it's totally different because people's rights are being infringed on, and it's not narrowly tailored, so it wouldn't be constitutional. But this is. So in order to uphold the social contract, uphold the Constitution, which is the basis of our society, like we are advocating to uphold the Constitution. Without the Constitution, there'd be no rule of law or legitimacy of the American government. It's the total foundation of the American government. The government should act on it. And to uphold the lives of American citizens. And also because they basically conceded that we win under reasonable scrutiny, which is what this would likely be ruled under anyways, because they concede narrowly tailored and least restrictive means. So basically, for all these reasons, I just strong vote in favor of the government team. Thank you.
Good guys.
Great job.
Good debate.
Good job.
Where are you guys from?
Denmark.
Here. Okay, got it.